There's a particular cruelty in the way history sometimes dismantles the things it creates. Port Royal, Jamaica, in the second half of the 17th century, was perhaps the clearest example the world has ever produced of a city built entirely on the logic of its own destruction. It was, by almost every measurable standard, a triumph. It was also, by that exact same standard, doomed, not despite its success, but because of it. That is not a poetic observation. It is a mechanical truth of what happened there. By 1692, Port Royal had become the wealthiest city in the Western Hemisphere. Not the largest, not the most powerful by naval force alone. The wealthiest in terms of concentrated private wealth per square foot. It surpassed London. A peninsula barely a mile long held more gold, more taverns, more brothels, more merchants, and more working capital than almost anywhere else on earth. The Royal Navy used its harbor. The English crown depended on its revenues. Pirates sheltered there legally, spent their plunder openly, and were celebrated rather than hanged. Merchants from across the Atlantic built their fortunes in its counting houses. Enslaved people from Africa labored in its walls and kitchens under conditions that generated staggering returns for men who never once questioned souls. The city worked. That was the point. And that was the problem. Because every mechanism that made Port Royal function, its strategic geography, its symbiotic relationship with privateering, its position as a commercial node of the English Caribbean, was not a foundation. It was a pressure system. And pressure systems do not hold forever. They release, sometimes gradually, sometimes all at once. On June 7, 1692, between 11:30 in the morning and a little afternoon, roughly two-thirds of Port Royal slid into the Caribbean Sea. The earthquake lasted less than 2 minutes. It killed somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people immediately. Thousands more died of disease in the days that followed. An entire city, the richest, most chaotic, most deliberately sinful trading port in the Atlantic world, was erased in the span of a single church service. Contemporary witnesses called it divine judgment. Modern seismologists call it soil liquefaction. Both descriptions are technically accurate. Neither one explains how Port Royal got there. To understand what fell into the sea that morning, you have to understand what kind of thing Port Royal actually was. Not in the mythology, not in the sensational tabloid language that would follow it through centuries of popular history, but in the specific, operational, political sense. What were the real mechanisms that built it? What made it not just tolerable but actively protected by the English state? And why did those mechanisms, so effective for so long, carry inside them precise vulnerability that the earthquake would expose? The answer begins not with pirates or prostitutes or heaps of Spanish gold, though all of those figure heavily in the story. It begins with a geographic accident, an imperial calculation, and a decision made in London to weaponize a piece of Caribbean coastline in ways that would produce consequences no one in Whitehall had fully thought through. Port Royal sat at the tip of the Palisadoes, a long, thin spit of sand and gravel that extended from the eastern edge of Jamaica into Kingston Harbor. The harbor itself was extraordinary, one of the finest natural anchorages in the Caribbean, deep enough for large warships, sheltered enough to ride out hurricanes, and positioned directly on the trade routes that connected the Spanish Main to Europe. When England seized Jamaica from Spain in 1655, a campaign that was itself the product of a failed attempt to take Hispaniola, the island was not yet the jewel anyone imagined it would become. It was a consolation prize, and Port Royal, at that point, was barely a fortification. What transformed it was need. England, newly in possession of a Caribbean colony it had not entirely planned for, required income, required naval defense, and required leverage against the Spanish Empire that still considered Jamaica rightfully theirs. The solution that emerged over the following decade was elegant in its cynicism. England would invite the privateers, licensed pirates, men operating under letters of marque that gave their plunder a veneer of legality, to use Port Royal as their base. They would attack Spanish shipping and Spanish settlements. England would take a share of the proceeds. Port Royal would provide the harbor, the supplies, the repair yards, and the market where captured goods could be converted into currency. It was, in the language of today, an outsourced military commercial operation. And it worked spectacularly well. Within 15 years, Port Royal had become the hub of Caribbean privateering, a city shaped entirely around the economics of violence at sea and the conversion of that violence into tradable wealth. The infrastructure that grew up around it, the taverns, the merchants, the craftsmen, the slave markets, the warehouses, was not a symptom of moral failure. It was a natural consequence of a specific economic engine running at full capacity. By the 1670s, Port Royal was generating more customs revenue for the English crown than any other colonial possession. It was also, by that same point, beginning to outlive the political conditions that had made it useful. That tension between what the city had become and what the empire now needed it to be is where the real story begins. And it is a tension that the earthquake of 1692 would not so much resolve as expose in the most permanent way imaginable. The man most responsible for making Port Royal what it became never intended to build a city. He intended to survive. Henry Morgan arrived in the Caribbean sometime in the 1650s, though the precise circumstances of his arrival have been disputed since before he was famous enough for anyone to care about disputing them. What is certain is that by the late 1660s, he had established himself as the most effective privateer operating out of Port Royal, and by 1671, he had accomplished something that even his own employers in London found difficult to explain away. He had attacked and sacked Panama City, a Spanish colonial capital on the Pacific coast, with a force of roughly 1,200 men, crossing the isthmus on foot through jungle, fighting a pitched battle against a numerically superior force, and returning with plunder that remains one of the largest single hauls in the history of Caribbean privateering. He did this 18 months after England and Spain had signed a peace treaty. This is the central Morgan paradox, and it maps almost perfectly onto the paradox of Port Royal itself. Morgan was simultaneously the city's greatest asset and its most dangerous liability. His raids brought wealth, prestige, and a kind of terrifying military credibility to English Jamaica. They also routinely threatened to destabilize the diplomatic arrangements that England needed to maintain. With Spain, he was arrested after Panama, sent to London under nominal custody, and then, because England still needed exactly what he provided, returned to Jamaica as its lieutenant governor, effectively the second most powerful man on the island. The English crown knighted him. Then they sent him back to the city he had helped build, tasked with suppressing the very piracy that had made him famous. Port Royal, by this point in the 1670s and into the 1680s, had reached its full operational complexity. The city's layout itself reflected the logic of its economy. The walls extended nearly a third of a mile along the harbor front, capable of handling dozens of vessels simultaneously. Behind them ran Thames Street. The name was deliberate, an assertion of colonial legitimacy, lined with merchant houses, warehouses, and the offices of factors and brokers who handled the paperwork of plunder. Further inland, if the narrow peninsula could be said to have an inland, the streets compressed into a density that no English city of comparable wealth would have tolerated. 2,000 structures on roughly 50 acres. Taverns on nearly every corner. By some contemporary estimates, one drinking establishment for every 10 adult residents, a ratio that has never been equaled in the documented history of urban settlement. The taverns were not incidental. They were financial, infrastructure, in a city where the primary economic actors were men who had just returned from months at sea with perishable wealth, gold and silver and goods that needed to be converted into something storable. The tavern was a clearinghouse. Deals were made there. Crews were recruited there. Captains settled accounts with merchants overrun because the alternative was carrying coin through streets where no one had any particular reason to be honest. The drinking was real, and it was excessive by any standard, but it was also functional. It was a lubrication of a specific kind of commerce that could not have operated any other way. The same logic applied to everything that made Port Royal scandalous by the standards of the English moral imagination. The brothels existed because a privateer economy produced men with sudden wealth and no permanent domestic arrangements. The gambling dens existed because risk tolerance was a professional prerequisite for anyone in the business of maritime raiding, and men who spent their working lives calculating the odds of dying for a share of a Spanish cargo hold did not become conservative with their leisure. The slave market on the waterfront, one of the largest in the English Caribbean, existed because Port Royal's merchant class had recognized, well before the plantation system fully matured in Jamaica's interior, that enslaved labor was the most reliable generator of long-term returns in the Atlantic economy. None of this was accidental. None of it was the product of moral collapse or social disorder. It was the entirely predictable output of an economic system that the English state had deliberately constructed, actively protected, and financially depended upon, which is precisely what made the political shift of the 1680s so consequential and so dangerous for the city's long-term coherence. By the mid-1680s, the strategic calculus that had originally justified Port Royal's existence was changing. England was no longer in the same posture towards Spain. The privateering era was ending, not because anyone in Port Royal had become more virtuous, but because European great power politics had shifted to the point where licensed maritime raiding was more diplomatically costly than it was worth. The Treaty of Madrid in 1670 had already committed England to suppressing piracy in the Caribbean. Enforcement had been inconsistent and often cynical. Morgan's own career was proof of that, but the direction of travel was clear. Port Royal's response to this shift was instructive. The city did not reform. It adapted. The privateers became merchants. The merchants absorbed the privateer networks. The same men who had spent 20 years raiding Spanish ships now ran import-export operations, slave trading, houses, and lending businesses that served the plantation economy developing in Jamaica's interior. The violence moved off the water and into the legal structures of colonial commerce. The wealth remained. The density remained. The infrastructure of excess remained. What changed was the city's relationship to legitimate power. Port Royal in 1692 was no longer a privateer haven under protection of strategic necessity. It was a commercial city of enormous wealth, built on unstable ground, literally and otherwise, that had not yet been asked to reckon with what it had become. The earthquake asked that question for it. There are cities that grow into their geography, and there are cities that are imposed upon it. Port Royal was the second kind, and the land knew it. The Palisadoes, that long, narrow tongue of sediment extending into Kingston Harbor, was not, by any geological standard, a place where a city should have been built. It was composed primarily of sand, gravel, and loose fill, much of it deposited by centuries of tidal action and human intervention as the settlement expanded. The ground beneath Port Royal streets and foundations was, in the technical language of seismology, acutely susceptible to liquefaction, the process by which saturated, loosely packed sediment loses its structural integrity during seismic shaking and behaves, temporarily but catastrophically, like a liquid. The people who built Port Royal did not know this in those terms, but they knew the ground was soft. They knew the water table was high. They knew that driving foundation posts more than a few feet produced nothing solid. They built anyway, because the harbor was worth it, because the commerce demanded it, because the alternative was to leave one of the finest natural anchorages in the Caribbean unoccupied, and that was a thought that no English colonial administrator in the second half of the 17th century was capable of entertaining seriously. So they built on sand, and they filled the sand with gold, and they called it a city. By the morning of June 7, 1692, Port Royal had been experiencing an unusually dry spring. The heat was already severe by mid-morning. The harbor was busy. Several vessels at anchor, others being careened along the walls, merchant ships loading and unloading the goods that kept the city's economy turning. The streets were populated with the ordinary traffic of a Tuesday morning, merchants heading to their counting houses, laborers on the waterfront, soldiers at Fort Charles maintaining the watch that had become largely ceremonial now that the age of serious Spanish threat had passed. At 11:53 in the morning, the time preserved, because a stopped pocket watch was later recovered from the rubble at that exact position, the first shockwave arrived. What followed was not the dramatic single convulsion that popular accounts have sometimes described. There were multiple shocks in rapid succession, each one compounding the damage of the last. The ground did not simply shake. It moved. In the areas closest to the waterfront, the most densely built, most heavily loaded sections of the city, the saturated sand beneath the streets began to liquefy. Buildings did not fall over in the conventional sense. They sank. Whole streets dropped several feet as the ground beneath them ceased to behave as ground. Structures that had stood for 30 years slid sideways, cracked open, or simply descended into the earth as if the peninsula was slowly swallowing them. The harbor did the rest. The liquefaction of the waterfront destabilized the seafloor immediately adjacent to the Palisadoes, triggering a localized tsunami that rolled across the harbor and back, carrying with it the wreckage of walls, warehouses, and the bodies of those who had fallen into the water during the initial shaking. Ships at anchor were thrown against each other. The naval frigate HMS-1 was lifted entirely and carried over what had been the rooftops of houses, coming to rest inland. If inland still meant anything on a peninsula that had just lost a third of its surface area to the sea. Within 7 minutes of the first shock, approximately a third of Port Royal's physical structure had either collapsed, sunk below the waterline, or been swept away. 2,000 people, by conservative estimate, died in the initial event. The numbers would climb significantly in the days that followed as disease, dysentery, fever, the particular lethality of warm Caribbean water mixed with decomposing human remains and ruptured food stores moved through the survivors with the efficiency that 18th century medicine had no tools to counter. The Reverend Emmanuel Heath, an Anglican minister who survived the earthquake by chance, wrote one of the most frequently cited eyewitness accounts. He described the ground opening and closing in waves, men sinking to their necks in what had been solid streets, the sound of the city, a specific, terrible sound he could not properly name, as it went under. He described it as judgment. He meant that theologically, and he was not alone. Within days of the disaster, the language of divine retribution had already attached itself to Port Royal with the adhesive force of a story that was simply too convenient to resist. The wickedest city on earth had been swallowed by the earth. The symmetry was irresistible, and it shaped the way Port Royal was remembered for the next 3 centuries, with a persistence that no amount of subsequent historical scholarship has entirely managed to dislodge. But the theological interpretation, whatever its emotional satisfactions, obscures something more interesting and more disturbing than divine punishment. Port Royal was not destroyed because it was sinful. It was destroyed because of what sinful, in the specific operational sense, had actually required of the physical place. The density, the extraordinary, unprecedented density of structures packed onto 50 acres of unstable sediment, was not incidental to Port Royal's character. It was a direct expression of its economic logic. The city was as dense as it was because density was profitable. Every square foot of the palisadoes that could hold a building held one, because every building generated revenue, and revenue was a point. That density is precisely what maximized the death toll. That density is what turned a significant earthquake into a civilizational erasure. The very compression of wealth that made Port Royal extraordinary made it uniquely vulnerable to the specific failure mode that the geology had always been preparing. It was not God who built the trap. It was commerce. Port Royal did not disappear from the map after June 7, 1692. That is important to understand, because the story the earthquake tells is not a story about ending. It is a story about what survives when the thing that made a place matter is suddenly, violently removed. Rescue efforts began within hours, though the word rescue overstates what was possible. Survivors pulled others from the wreckage of partially collapsed buildings. Ships in the harbor, those that remained intact, took on the injured and the dying. Within days, a tent city had formed on the fragment of the palisadoes that remained above water, populated by people who had nowhere else to go and no resources with which to go. There, looting began almost immediately, both by survivors and by men who arrived by boat from the surrounding coastline, drawn by the knowledge that one of the wealthiest concentrations of private property in the hemisphere had just become accessible. Contemporary accounts describe bodies being stripped of rings and valuables before they were cold, warehouses broken open by men wading chest-deep through flooded streets, the entire moral architecture of the city, such as it had been, dissolving in the aftermath with even greater speed than the physical one. The English colonial government made several attempts to rebuild. A new settlement was established at Kingston, across the harbor, which had the significant advantage of sitting on ground that was not a narrow spit of saturated sand. Port Royal itself was partially reconstructed. The fort was repaired. A reduced commercial district was re-established. The harbor remained in use because the harbor was still the harbor, unchanged and still extraordinary regardless of what had happened to the city beside it. But the reconstruction never recovered the scale, the density, or the particular economic energy of what had existed before June 7th. A fire in 1703 destroyed much of what had been rebuilt. A hurricane in 1722 damaged it further. Another hurricane in 1744. The pattern was consistent. Each time Port Royal attempted to reconstitute itself, the same vulnerabilities that had defined it in its peak years reasserted themselves. The geography had not changed. The instability had not changed. Only the economic justification for tolerating those conditions had disappeared, and without it, Each successive disaster was simply a disaster rather than the acceptable cost of an enormously profitable enterprise. By the mid-18th century, Port Royal had become what it remains today, a small fishing community on the tip of the Palisadoes, populated by a few hundred people, notable primarily for the archaeological interest of what lies beneath the harbor waters adjacent to it. The sunken city, the warehouses, the streets, the structural remains of what was briefly the most concentrated wealth in the Western Hemisphere, is one of the best preserved underwater archaeological sites in the world. The cold anaerobic conditions of the harbor floor have maintained organic materials that would have decayed centuries ago in any terrestrial context. Timbers, leather, ceramic vessels, navigational instruments, personal effects. The texture of daily life in Port Royal has been preserved in extraordinary detail precisely because the sea took it quickly and kept it carefully. There is an irony in that preservation which the city's original inhabitants would not have appreciated. Port Royal spent its entire existence generating wealth that was meant to be spent, circulated, converted, and spent again. The economic logic of the place was fundamentally opposed to preservation, and yet the thing that preserved it most completely was a catastrophe that ended it. What remains above water is more instructive in a different way. The reputation. The specific, lurid, endlessly recycled reputation of Port Royal as a wickedest city on earth outlasted the city itself by centuries and shows no particular sign of fading. The phrase appears in travel writing, in historical fiction, in documentary narration, in tourism materials for modern Jamaica, in the metadata of archaeological expeditions. It is one of the most durable urban epithets in the English language, and it has attached itself to a place that ceased to exist in any meaningful sense before the 18th century had reached its midpoint. That durability is worth examining, because it reveals something about the story the earthquake made possible. Before June 7, 1692, Port Royal was complicated. It was an instrument of English imperial policy. It was a commercial hub. It was a labor market for enslaved people. It was a naval base. It was a place where the economics of maritime violence had been successfully converted into the economics of legitimate trade. It was, in short, a system, messy, contradictory, morally incoherent, and enormously productive in the way that most successful colonial enterprises have been. The earthquake simplified all of that into a single image, the sinful city, swallowed by divine judgment, gone in a moment. That image was easier to transmit, easier to remember, and easier to use in the complicated truth. It transformed Port Royal from a case study in colonial political economy into a morality tale, which meant that the most important things it had to teach about the relationship between economic incentives and physical risk, about the way states construct and then abandon the mechanisms of their own enrichment, about the human capacity to build elaborately on foundations that everyone involved knows to be unstable, were buried under the more satisfying narrative of wickedness punished. Those lessons did not sink with the city. They have simply been waiting, in the way that submerged things wait, for someone to bring them back to the surface. Port Royal was not destroyed because it was exceptional. It was destroyed because it was, beneath the spectacle and the legend, entirely ordinary, a place where people made rational decisions within the incentive structures available to them, built something that worked brilliantly within its own logic, and never seriously reckoned with the ground they were standing on. That is not a 17th century story. That is the oldest story there is.